Hi, I'm Prashant Irubane. I'm the director at Pune International Center. I welcome you all here. And to begin with, may I invite on stage Mr. Yashwant Sinha, sir, please. Dr. Vijay Kelkar, sir, please. Anu Aga, ma'am, please. It's great honor for PIC to have amongst us Mr. Yashwant Sinha, who kindly agreed to launch this series of lectures. And we also thank one of our own, Ms. Anu Aga, who agreed to chair the session today. Thank you. And before I invite Dr. Kelkar to kindly introduce our guest today, if I could very quickly introduce the audience to our guest. So among the audience today, we have the members of Pune International Center, the trustees. We have good 25, 26 of academic institutions that are our members. So faculty and students of those institutions have also gathered here. Apart from those, we have aspiring students, aspiring civil servants rather, at the state and center, that is students of MPSC and UPSC. They have also gathered here. And of course, there are friends from media, and there are rather, in general, Punekars who are always interested in something as exciting as this happening in Pune. So with that, may I now request Dr. Vijay Kelkar to kindly introduce our guest today. Thank you. Actually, before that, so there is a small penalty for those smartphones and dumb ones that are not switched off. So may I kindly request you to please switch off your phones. Thank you.
Srimati Anu Aga, Shri Yashwant Sinha, distinguished speaker this evening, and my friends. On my behalf and on the behalf of the PIC, I welcome you all for this evening's lecture. I have to perform two important tasks this evening. One is to introduce our distinguished speaker, and the other is to introduce our new lecture series of the PIC. Shri Yashwant Sinha has indeed adorned a number of high positions in the state government of Bihar, government of India, India's parliament oversight committees. He was chairman of our standing committee, and also international financial institutions like World Bank and IMF. He was first chairman of development committee of the board of governors of the World Bank. Mr. Sinha joined Indian Administrative Service in 1960, and during his services with the government of Bihar, he was also Principal Secretary, the charismatic Chief Minister of Bihar, Karpuri Thakur, who many consider as probably the best Chief Minister Bihar ever had. He also served in the Government of India in Ministry of Commerce and Ministry of Surface Transport, and of course our missions abroad, looking at serving in the area of commercial policy. In early 80s, he resigned from the service and joined active politics. In 1990, when India was facing a major crisis, and when Chandrasekhar was the Prime Minister of India, he navigated India from one of the worst crises we faced, which was as a finance minister. And in fact, number of careful historians now accept that if history is written, now when will be written, it will recognize that it is Mr. Yashwant Sinha who really initiated the reform, which was later on, of course, picked up by Prime Minister Narasimha Rao and Dr. Manmohan Singh. Thereafter, he came back. Then, of course, the government changed. He came back to Minister of Finance in 1998 as a finance minister under the Vajpayee's prime ministership. And we should recall with gratitude that they have incredibly successfully handled the Indian economy through the Asian crisis, the fallout of, in fact, everybody warned us, fallout from nuclear sanctions, and also the Kargil war. In fact, you and I didn't even feel a pinch of this crisis, and I think we owed a great deal to him for the way it was handled. He has been, I would argue, sir, the exceptionally successful crisis manager India ever had. But this is only a partial picture of him. He has also been a very successful reformer. In fact, he was the initiator of what people call second generation reforms, which included VAT, reform of VAT, which is laid the foundation of modernization of indirect tax system, capital markets reforms, and many sectoral reforms like telecom reforms, and also entire road transport. But one of the most important reform which really triggered India's golden age of growth was his interest rate reforms. It was the first, it was a very courageous and important step to start introduction of interest rates, and which really became the launching part for India's growth, which I call golden age growth. He also, during his services in our country, also served in the most important as a member of the highest level of policy making, like member of Cabinet Political Affairs, Cabinet Security, and contributed to the security of our country into all its own dimensions. It's really a great privilege to have him here today. And sir, we welcome you again for launching our lecture series. Now let me turn to this lecture series. As you know, I mean, it probably starts, maybe some repetition, but I think PIC is a forum to promote fair, free and informed debate. Mashelkar, our president, sir, calls it Vichar Manthan Kendra, as a definition of his definition. It's also a platform to promote art and culture flourishing. But most important for me at least, it seeks to nurture liberalism, which has been the soul of this great city. One of the important functions of think tank, we are also a think tank, is to bring out policy papers. And we have brought out so far 5 policy papers. And I may sound a little self-serving, but our policy papers has reflected and has changed a number of policies in the government, central government and also state government. We also set up to promote our research as a group called Policy Research Advisory Group, where we have members of people like distinguished academics like Professor Pete, who I see is here, Professor Parshikar, Professor Apte, who is from Ferguson College. We also have the member Ravi Pandit and chairman of our Center of Advanced Center of Security, Air Marshal Gokhale. And one of our first meetings, it was felt by the group that to improve, we want to improve policies, let's first understand how they are made. And that is the source of this endeavor of PIC, to understand science and art of policy making, so we can understand the processes, hopefully with the aim to improve them in the future. So this is the first of this series, and I'm really, really grateful and honored to have Sri Yashwant Sinha. I will end on one personal note. He was my minister. He was gracious enough to accept me as his finance secretary, and I personally learned a great deal from him on policy making. And one important insight he gave me, I don't know if I forgot or not, but he always used to tell me, he says, Vijay, remember, India lives in multiple centuries at the same time. So when you think of India, it is a very complex India. It's not so simple that you get your textbook and start making policies. Remember, many of us live at the same time, multiple centuries. And that was really, for me, an eye-opener about the way you think about policies. And so, sir, with this, I'll hand over now to our distinguished chairperson, Anuvaga, to take the proceeding. Thank you.
Thank you, Vijay. And may I please request Mr. Sinha to now address us? Would you like to do it from here?
The chairperson of this function, Srimati Anuaga, my colleague from many years, Dr. Vijay Kelkar, ladies and gentlemen, I am indeed extremely honored and privileged that the Pune International Center has invited me to launch the lecture series on policy making in India. I have no doubt in my mind that it is not my experience or my qualifications as much as my proximity to Vijay Kelkar, which has brought me here this afternoon. But this is an invitation which I could not refuse. One, because Pune is always a very interesting place to come to, and the large audience which has turned up, despite this being a Saturday afternoon, is a tribute to the intellectual richness of this place. And also because Vijay Kelkar was the one who was inviting me. And if I could add a third reason, it was because the subject is extremely interesting. And I'm sure that as the PIC moves forward and more lectures are organized on the art and science of making policy in India, we'll have really a rich tapestry of the various angles which are involved in this. When we talk of policy, the first question which comes to mind is what exactly is policy and how do you define policy in this country? Because policies are made, then they are translated into laws, maybe, may not be. They are made and then they are implemented through the various yojanas that we have. Sometimes a policy continues, sometimes a policy is discontinued, sometimes a policy succeeds, sometimes a policy fails. And therefore, it's a rather complex subject to offer one's views on. But I will try, and from my own experience and from recent history, pick up a few things to demonstrate how policies were made. And when Vijay Kelkar had written to me some months ago, inviting me to this function, he had posed some 7 questions. I remember in that letter of November, he had posed some 7 questions. There were 7 issues, more not questions but issues, to which he wanted me to relate. And since then I've been thinking about it, and I thought that the best way to relate to those issues and some other issues will be to talk from my own experience of some of the major policy shifts, and then see how well or not so well they are able to answer the issues or the questions which have been raised. Now, there have been many policies, and policies are a dime a dozen and being made almost every day. But there are 2 which have been real game changers in the last 3 decades. And I'm not going back to the time of independence or immediately thereafter. I am relating myself to what I have personally been a part of. The first one, of course, was the major shift in the philosophy of economic policy in 1991. Economic and industrial policy. And that was a true game changer in our history. And the second that I will pick up will be the nuclear tests of 1998 and the subsequent evolution of the nuclear doctrine that India has adopted. And the two relate to my experience first in the Ministry of Finance and then subsequently in the Ministry of External Affairs. Then there have been any number of policy shifts, changes, this, that, and the other. But I would not say that they have been game changers in the same way in which these two policies have been. The economic and industrial policy, I am extremely obliged to Vijay for having said that in a way, I was also partly responsible for the reform, beginning of the reform movement in this country. In 1990-91, as many of you will recall, I was briefly the finance minister in the Chandrasekhar government. And that was the crisis, the like of which I have never seen in my long administrative or political career. Because we were literally down on our knees. There was nothing which was going for us, and as if to add to all our troubles, we also had political instability when after 4 months Chandrasekhar was forced to resign. Now I have no wish whatsoever to take away credit from anyone. And I leave it to others, but I have some remarks which have been made by at least two well-known economists. One is Dr. I.G. Patel. He, in an article which he wrote sometime in October 1991, he said, and I quote, this is a book which was published in 2007. This is my tenure in Finance Ministry, The Confessions of a Swadeshi Reformer. It is not a bestseller, but the book is there. And I have quoted this in this book, and I am quoting it to you now. It was left to the feckless Chandrasekhar government to start serious negotiations with the fund when it was almost too late. The Chandrasekhar government began to behave more responsibly than most people had expected. But the rug was pulled from under its feet when it was not allowed to present a budget, which I am sure was discussed with the fund and contained at least some features of sensible adjustment. It is no secret that IMF assistance was widely assumed to be forthcoming as soon as the budget was passed by the Chandrasekhar government. But our political masters willed otherwise. Now a number of theories flow from this, and I will come to them later. The other is a good friend of ours, no more, Dr. Arjun Sengupta, who was a member of the Rajya Sabha. When I became finance minister again in 1998, he was speaking in Rajya Sabha on the budget, and he said, and I quote, "Very few people know that Yashwant Sinha, as finance minister of the Chandrasekhar government, had prepared a most revolutionary budget in 1991. In many ways, that budget was more radical than the budget that was presented later that year by Dr. Manmohan Singh when he introduced the Narasimha Rao package of economic reforms. For reasons quite well known, Yashwant Sinha's budget could not be presented to Parliament. If it were, it probably would have been a major Indian response to the 1991 crisis. Then he goes on to say that he thought that I present equally radical budget and he was disappointed. He did not belong to the Bharatiya Janata Party. So he was disappointed and he said, you did not present equally radical budget. Then again he said, I must admit that Sri Yashwant Sinha is one of the country's very famous reformers. There is no doubt about it. As finance minister, I think we should admit he was the original reformer. His first budget, which he prepared before Manmohan Singh's budget, I happen to have seen, I don't know, I'm not responsible for showing the budget to him, was a unique budget. That was the first original reform budget. And I'm quoting these two to make 2-3 points. The first is, whether it was my budget or it was Manmohan Singh's budget subsequently or Narasimha Rao's industrial reform policy of 1991. 1991 was a game changer year as far as economic direction of the country was concerned. And therefore, without going into who was responsible, who was not responsible, there are a few things that we must recall to mind. One, it was not voluntary, it was not deliberate, it was a response to a crisis. And I wonder if India had not been reduced to 15 days foreign exchange reserves or $1 billion, I wonder if India would have launched itself on the path of economic reforms. So one, it was a response to a crisis. Two, that despite that crisis which the country has never faced before and I hope will never face in future, despite that crisis, politics intervened in such a way that the government of the day, the finance minister of the day, was prevented from presenting a budget. And then we are all aware of the turn that history took, the assassination of Sri Rajiv Gandhi and then Narasimha Rao ji becoming the Prime Minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh becoming the Finance Minister, and then further movement on the reform path. But the reforms of 91 were extremely path-breaking. What happened to the reforms of 91? Like a ship, they ran aground just 2 years later. Because again politics intervened. It was not national politics. It was the politics within the Congress party, which was in power at that point of time, when the old leadership or older leadership of the Congress party persuaded or forced Narasimha Rao not to carry on with the reforms. And we saw the end of the reforms somewhere in 93-94. Then we moved forward. There were a lot of reforms subsequently. Chidambaram's period, my period. But what is salutary in this is the fact that a lot of reforms were carried out, policy reforms. But then a time came when they were all reversed. So the role of ideology and politics, I always say that those who were the standard bearers of socialism, the socialistic pattern of society, became the flag bearers of economic reforms later. And again, the same set of people became the champions of the policy of entitlements. Why? Because, and this is the first lesson that we have to learn as far as policy making in this country is concerned, is that politics overtakes everything. It is not the economy is stupid. It is the politics is stupid. And the politician will not mind running the country to the ground if it suits that politician's political interests. This is the long history of economic reforms that we have seen in the last 25 years. Now, we have some recent examples. One of the most momentous steps taken in the last 10 months by this new government has been the abolition of the Planning Commission. We were all used to the Planning Commission. Suddenly one day the Prime Minister announced from the ramparts of the Red Fort that the Planning Commission will be abolished. But has the plan been abolished? If the latest budget is an example, then we still have the plan and the non-plan. And then, as Vijay and I were discussing earlier, we have the 14th Finance Commission recommendations, which have raised the share of the states to 42% from 32% in Government of India's divisible pool. So we'll have to see what happens to this whole thing called planning in India, because I can tell you from experience on the ground, because I used to chair as a member of parliament a committee at the district level, of which the district magistrate and all the development departments are members, along with all the local MLAs and the local bodies, Zilla Parishad president. And in those meetings, we used to deal with Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Program. And one of the things prescribed in the Act which governs this scheme is that each panchayat will prepare a plan. It will prepare a 5-year plan to coincide with our national 5-year plan, and then annually select the number of schemes in the panchayat that they want to be undertaken in that particular year. Now, when you abolish the Planning Commission and you abolish planning, then what happens to that? How are we going to deal with the panchayat level plans? How are we going to deal with the district level plans? How are we going to deal with the state level plans? And what is going to happen to the allocation of planned funds? And it's not such a simple thing that tomorrow you will say there will be no plan, non-plan. It will be just one expenditure, call it by whatever name you want. And it's not even a question of what happens to the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Program at the panchayat level. The question is what happens to the devolution of funds between the center and the states. What the finance commissions do, as Vijay knows very well because he has headed one, is devolution of the so-called divisible pool of taxes at the central level, and that becomes a constitutional obligation. It has to be done. The devolution of plan funds was discretionary, and that is why the state chief ministers were summoned to Delhi. The annual plan was discussed within the framework of the 5-year plan, and the plan funds were then devolved to the state governments to run their own schemes in certain cases and largely to run the central schemes. Now what is going to happen to that devolution? Someday, not too late in future, the government of India will have to think about it. One, the division of plan, non-plan, as far as the expenditure budget is concerned. And second, the issue of devolution of funds from the Government of India to the states and to the local bodies. And I was telling Vijay that even a political opponent of the present regime, like the Chief Minister of Bihar, Nitish Kumar, has said that the Government of India has certain responsibilities. Who will look at equity at all India level? Who will look at social justice at all India level? Who will be responsible for anything special for the backward regions of this country? Who will be responsible for the class differences which exist in our country? Can the Government of India relieve itself of all the responsibilities? I don't think it is going to be possible in a country like India. So the Government of India schemes will remain, some of them. And the devolution of funds will have to remain. But how will they be distributed, and how will the states start spending on the schemes which they will be masters of, are all issues which will remain in the future. But coming back to the issue of economic reforms, there was a lot that we did in the time that we were in government from 1998 to 2004. But if you ask me today, do we have a national consensus for economic reforms? My question is a big no. And I recall the speech that Dr. Manmohan Singh gave as Prime Minister from the ramparts of the Red Fort, I think it was 212, when he said that the time had come when we should forget our political differences and take issues of economic policy in the same way as we take issues of national security. And there must be a consensus on some basic reforms, but it is easier said than done. I don't see any consensus on economic reforms taking place in a hurry, because the accepted policy of every political party in this country has been, I will support reforms when I am in government, I will oppose reforms when I am in opposition. And we are no exception. We are no exception. I'll give you another example, and then maybe I'll come to the issues that you had raised. Insurance sector reforms. When I had prepared the bill in 1999 for introducing the private sector in insurance, and also the participation of foreign capital in insurance, I had suggested, we had included a provision in the bill that foreign investment will be allowed up to 49%. Foreign direct investment up to 49%, 51% will belong to the Indian partner. So we took the bill to Parliament, then there was a standing committee, and then we had to negotiate with the Congress party, because we did not have a majority in Rajya Sabha. So we had to negotiate with the Congress party, and I remember a number of meetings that we had, and it was the Congress party, Anu Agaji, which insisted that it should be 26%. And they forced my hand. Even in the Lok Sabha, after I had made the amendment, they asked me a question. They said, we would like a guarantee from you that as it has happened in the telecom sector, 26% will not be breached even through financial engineering. And there is my statement in Lok Sabha to the effect that we will stick to 26%, whatever may happen. This was 2000. 4 years down the line, Congress party, when they came into office, suddenly became wiser. And Chidambaram in his first budget of 2004 talked about 49%. Then it went through all the rigmarole. And came to the Standing Committee on Finance, which I used to chair in the 15th Lok Sabha. And the Standing Committee of Parliament, as you are aware, is a multi-party committee with the majority of the ruling party or ruling coalition. And unanimously, the Standing Committee in 2011 came to the conclusion that foreign equity should not be raised to beyond 26%. That was a conclusion of the Standing Committee. Now, I am not going into the reasons why we came to that conclusion, but that was the recommendation. Then from 2011 to 2013, end of 2013, when the UPA government had some hope that the 49% might go through with our support, we kept talking about things. But we never saw our way to assuring the UPA government that we'll support your 49%. So the issue was never tested on the floor of the House, in Lok Sabha especially, because our support was not forthcoming. Then the government changed in 2014. And we felt that no, it has to be 49% foreign investment. And we not only felt so strongly about it, but we even brought an ordinance that it will be 49%. And through the various parliamentary rigmarole, now that is 49%. But I can quote to you chapter and verse of how political parties have changed their stand in government and in opposition. So it is politics all the way. And I am coming to now the nuclear tests and the nuclear doctrine to show how politics was playing a role even then. The Bharatiya Janata Party had talked about India going nuclear in a session that they had in Patna in 1964. And that was the commitment of the Bharatiya Janata Party, that India should become nuclear. And in 1998, when Mr. Vajpayee became the Prime Minister of India, you were all aware that a few weeks after assuming charge as Prime Minister, he went for the nuclear tests. Now, what was the preparation for the meeting the fallout of the nuclear tests? I remember I was summoned to the Prime Minister's residence. So I went to the Prime Minister's house. Mr. Vajpayee did not meet me in the living room. He took me to his bedroom. And the first thought which I had was, I am going to lose my job. And otherwise, why should it be so secretive? So I went to his bedroom, and the two of us were there. Then he told me that we were going to have nuclear tests. And I now don't remember whether it was 10 days before the nuclear tests or 15 days before the nuclear tests, but he said that you have to be ready for the fallout of that event. Now, I did not ask him who are the other people that he had taken into confidence. I couldn't. I was also aware of what had happened when Narasimha Rao ji was the Prime Minister and how the Americans had intervened and not allowed India to test nuclear weapons. So there was nobody I could talk to. And this was a secret, such a secret that I had to keep it to myself. And I was writhing in bed and I was thinking about things, but without any conclusion. And then the tests happened on the 11th and 13th of May. And then we had a meeting with the Prime Minister, 5-6 of us, and we decided the future course of action. Then came the economic sanctions. But I'm saying that this was the fallout of a commitment which had been made by the Bharatiya Janata Party to the people of India way back in 1964, and when Mr. Vajpayee had the opportunity, he carried it out. But the policy was the important thing, the nuclear doctrine of India. And as far as the doctrine is concerned, it is something which went through the mill because a number of experts contributed to the evolution of the nuclear doctrine. I had moved to the Ministry of External Affairs by then. I recall to mind Mr. Jaswant Singh, who had gone to the Ministry of Finance, had a major contribution to make to the evolution of the nuclear doctrine. The issue came up before the Cabinet Committee on Security. It was discussed there in detail, and then it was adopted as national policy. Now, from these few examples, 1991 economic reforms was a handiwork of the officials serving in the Ministry of Finance and of the political input which the Prime Minister of the day would have received from his political colleagues in the cabinet. But as you are aware, budget making continues to be a secret exercise, and the only two persons in government who are involved are the Finance Minister and the Prime Minister. No third minister is involved in the budget exercise, except insofar as it might relate to his ministry. But even then, the final picture is not available to him before the budget is presented. But there are officials in the Ministry of Finance, especially people who belong to the so-called budget group, who are involved. And it is the handiwork of the budget group which thought of these reforms with inputs from wherever they could get the inputs. Ultimately, a policy decision taken by the Finance Minister and the Prime Minister. This is how the 1991 reforms took place. The industrial policy reforms, where history tells us largely on account of the initiative taken by the Prime Minister, Mr. Narasimha Rao, who was also the Industries Minister, and his Principal Secretary, Amarnath Verma. These were the two people who were largely responsible for the industrial policy reforms of 1991. The nuclear doctrine was as I said, a more comprehensive exercise, ultimately approved by the political leadership of the country. Abolition of the Planning Commission is the Prime Minister's own decision. What are the inputs he has received, one doesn't know. But it was quite clear that he wanted the Planning Commission to cease to exist. And that's how it has happened. And I have told you how the insurance sector reforms happened. There will be, for instance, when I sat down to prepare the list, I found that there were a number of other things, policies which the taxation reforms, the reform of the budget of the Government of India, the Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act, which was passed, disinvestment and privatization, policy on subsidies, petroleum sector deregulation, competition policy and the setting up of the Competition Commission. I mean, one can go on naming all these things, but they were not game changers in the sense in which these two were. And I think I'll add the third to this list, and that is the abolition of the Planning Commission. 91 economic reforms, 98 nuclear policy, nuclear tests, and 2014 is the abolition of the Planning Commission. Now, if anyone thinks that a lot of thinking goes into policy making, then I like to disabuse your mind of such information. And that is why policy making in our country has been a series of hits and misses. Policy making has been ad hoc. Policy making has been confined to a few people and a team. policy making has rarely been the outcome of a lot of thinking, a lot of inputs being marshaled and taking into account what is going to happen in future. Now, I'll just give one more example. I don't know whether one can describe it as policy. I'm not talking of national highways. I'm talking of the Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana, which we started in I think 2000, in the year 2000, yeah. Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana would not have seen the light of the day if my vehicle had not got stuck in my constituency while I was campaigning. Because we had rains, it was September, October when elections of 1999 were held, and I was traveling somewhere in my house, somewhere to somewhere, and the vehicle got stalled because there was mud on the roads. So when I came back and we were discussing the budget, I told the Prime Minister that we must concentrate on rural roads also, along with the national highways. And he readily agreed, and that's how the Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana was born. Now, there was one thing that we took a lot of care in designing the scheme, and that again was based on my experience of Lalu Raj in Bihar. Because what had happened in Lalu Raj was Government of India was sending money. They were all being put in something which was called the PL account, the Public Ledger account. And then there was no MIBA for those funds. And the Department of Animal Husbandry could draw upon those funds as much as they wanted. Now, misuse of Government of India funds meant for specific schemes is the order of the day, even today. So I was keen that we should not allow these funds to be misused. So we devised, with the Ministry of Rural Development, a very elaborate scheme to make sure that these funds were not misused. And I'm glad to say that scheme worked, and it's been one of the more successful schemes initiated by, designed by the Government of India and implemented by the state governments. But take the Rajiv Gandhi Gramin Vidyutikaran Yojana. The Rajiv Gandhi Gramin Vidyutikaran Yojana is for the electrification of villages. And the stipulation was, one, that an electric supply line will be taken to the village. It will be single phase. It will not be three phases. It will be single phase. Once the line reaches the village, then the electricity will be made available only to the below poverty line families. And the below poverty line families will light only one bulb in their house or hut or whatever. So this was the scheme. And I can tell you, because this was almost a full-time job, the line went to the village, it was connected. Now the BPL families will not be confining themselves only to one bulb, of that also of 25 watts or something. So they lighted more than one bulb. The APL, above poverty line people, said, why should we be deprived? So they all put a hook on that line and they started taking the line to their own houses. Some atta chakki walas also thought, why should I be lagging behind? So they also connected, with the result. And this is something which I did not know in all my years in the finance ministry, Vijay, that there are transformers of various sizes and power. In the Rajiv Gandhi Gramin Vidyutikaran Yojana, you have transformers of 10 what, kilowatts or megawatts or whatever, 15 and 25. 25 is the maximum. In no time, because of the overloading of the line, these transformers used to burn out. And my full-time job as a member of parliament was to get these transformers replaced. Because people will come to me, the electricity department will not oblige them. Now this was a design defect in this whole scheme. It could not, Manrega, the rural employment, is full of design defects. So when you sit in Delhi and prepare a policy and then a scheme to implement that policy, and you are not aware of the ground conditions, then you are likely to make a mistake. And this is the kind of mistakes that we have made in the past, we have made in the recent past. I hope we will not make them in future. And all this because the kind of care which should have been taken while designing these schemes were not taken, or it could be out of ignorance. I was telling Vijay, and I'll one of the last points which I'd like to make. I wanted a village to be electrified. And it's part of the policy, Rajiv Gandhi Gramin Vidyutikaran Yojana. So take the line. It was with great difficulty that the Department of Electricity or the Electricity Board agreed to my request to erect the poles, mount the wires, and take the line to that village. Okay. Then suddenly a ranger of the forest department woke up and he said, "You can't do this. This is a wildlife sanctuary and we have not taken care to protect the wild animals." The only wild animal in that forest, which was already destroyed, would have been no more than a dog. But they said the height of the line should be such that if an elephant were to cross, he will not touch the wires. So I hummed and hawed, but there was nothing I could do. This proposal then had to go to the State Wildlife Board headed by the Chief Minister. It took something like 10-12 months for that board to meet and take a view on this. They took a positive view, okay, but they didn't have the final powers. So it had to go to the National Wildlife Board, of which there was a subcommittee headed by the Minister for Environment and Forest. So in Delhi, I spoke to the minister, I spoke to the secretary of the ministry. I said, please take this on the agenda. It has come from the government of Jharkhand. Please take this on the agenda and approve it. There is nothing to it. So after 6-8 months, they took it on the agenda and it was approved. Then it took another 3 months for them to communicate it to the government of Jharkhand. Then the Damodar Valley Corporation, which is responsible for rural electrification, they had to prepare a project report on how much more it's going to cost to provide all the protection to wildlife. So they came out with some figure, 3 crore or 5 crore or something. So I said, who will now sanction it? They said that you speak to the chairman of the Rural Electrification Corporation. So I spoke to the chairman of the rural, he said, I will pass it on, but who will finally approve it? There is a committee headed by the Power Secretary of the Government of India, which will finally approve it. So I, like a fiend, I was after the Power Secretary, please approve it, please approve it. Finally it got approved. When finally it got approved, and I thought I had fought my last battle, then I was told it will have to go to the National Green Tribunal for because it's a wildlife sanctuary. So, National Green Tribunal. And I was telling Vijay, that's when I gave up. And mind you, I did not advise the villagers to do what they did. They just took law into their own hands and connected the village with electricity. And nobody has bothered. The village is now electrified. So the last point that I was making was, to make whatever kind of policy you make, implementation of that policy or implementability of that policy is most important. And if Adam Smith's economic man does not exist anymore, then please remember the character and efficiency of the people who are going to implement your policies. And therefore, I went to the net to collect how many national policies we have. And if somebody in the PIC or elsewhere to do an exercise, it will be worthwhile to find out how many national level policies we have. We have national level policy on agriculture, on industry, on transport, population, health, education, telecom, cyber security, climate change, children, senior citizens, forest, women. Think of it, and now we have Panchamrit, Act East, any number of national policies. And we have any number of national level schemes. Ultimately, where do we get stuck? We get stuck at the level of implementation. And therefore, I will say, one, our policies are made in a very ad hoc fashion, except maybe the 5-year plans where a lot of input goes. Most policies are the handiwork of a few people. Most policies could be the result of somebody's brainwave. But most policies fail because they are not implemented properly on the ground. And this is where partnership, not only in policy making, but partnership in policy implementation becomes very important. And when I am talking of partnership, I am not merely confining myself to the Government of India and the state governments. I am also talking of the local bodies at the district level, at the block level, and at the panchayat level. And it's my firm belief, it's my very firm belief that policies which are within the jurisdiction, territorial jurisdiction of a panchayat, of a district, or of the state should be left to be made by them. They will make the policies, they will be responsible for their implementation. They will have no alibis. Today, we have lots of alibis, and fixing responsibility for the failure of a policy is something which is unknown in the Government of India. And I'm sure it's the same story in the states also. So you make a mistake, you get away with it. You fail, you get away with it. You don't implement, you get away with it. And now, with as somebody was saying, with 13(1)(d) of the Anti-Corruption Act, most important disincentive why a civil servant will not act. So that is my take on policy making in India and its implementation. And I hope you'll have many more learned lectures on this subject as we go along. Thank you very much.
After this excellent talk, if you still have some questions, because he's covered so much, please do state them, give your name, and then state your question. Please don't give us a lecture. Just state your question.
Sir,
Your name, please.
I'm Hari. First of all, I'd like to thank you for that Gramin Yojana, sir. That road. I was in Nagaland, sir, and we got a road through. So thank you very much for that. I wanted to ask you one question, sir. How much pressure were you under from the IMF and the World Bank in 1991? That's one. Second, you have the advantage of being a bureaucrat as well as a politician. Why didn't you spend your entire energy making the bureaucrats more practical as a politician?
You know, it's like this with regard to the first question. As far as the IMF is concerned, we have something called the Article 4 consultations, isn't it? Article 4 of the IMF. It is an annual consultation which they hold with member states of the IMF. And in each annual consultation, they make an assessment of the economic situation and also make suggestions. Most of it does not find its way into the media. Sometimes it does. Now, I'm mentioning this because it's a political point to make. I used to make the same point, that you are doing it under the pressure of the IMF. The point is, you're going to them for money. And they have a right to tell you what's wrong with you. It's up to you to entirely accept what they're saying or sift and decide what you want to accept and what you don't want to accept. So when we went to the IMF, I didn't go, I mean the officials went in the January of 1991 to negotiate a special window which they had, under which we got, I think, about a couple of $1 billion. That was, there was no pressure as such because they were waiting for the budget. And of course they had their prescriptions. But the point I'm making is, whether it is economic policy or it's foreign policy or any policy, when you're talking to an institution or a friend, like, let's say, the head of another government, the friend advises you, like a friend will advise you on an issue which might concern you as an individual. I will not generally describe it as pressure. I will describe it as advice, because it's an advice, it's not a conditionality. And in 1991, I remember, we did not have detailed discussions with the IMF. That came later. But there was no pressure as such. There was advice which they wanted to give us for steering the ship of state. Second, about bureaucrats, I didn't need to do it because I had friends like Vijay Kelkar in the bureaucracy. So you took the bureaucracy along, and I had one great advantage, and that was that I belonged to the same clan, and therefore I was intrinsically trusted by them. I was not treated as a run-of-the-mill politician who will not understand. And I would say, in all my experience of government, that we always worked as a team. When we had budget discussions, for instance, which is a very important annual policy document, we all offered our views to the group very freely, including I myself. And I never said, you know, this is my thought and therefore it has to be accepted. You know, I was participating like an equal partner in that discussion.
Yes, please, at the back. Please wait till you get the mic.
Sir, as you said that the policies keep on changing according to the whims and fancies of the political party. So do you think there is a scope for an independent and neutral policy commission as such?
Even the Supreme Court of India has refused to interfere with policy. You know, so I mean, we must leave something to a democratically elected government in this country. Policy is not something which always interests politicians. And I remember when I was working with Karpuri Thakur in Bihar, I used to attend the cabinet meetings, and I will never forget that experience. Issues will come to the cabinet, so the cabinet secretary will say, "Sir, what is this? This is Bihar's 5-year plan, next 5-year plan. We are submitting our document to the Planning Commission." The ministers will say, "Pass it, pass it." What is this, sir? This is the memorandum that we are going to submit to the Finance Commission to raise the resources for Bihar. They'll say, pass it, no discussion. What is this? This is the transfer of the district magistrate of, let's say, Munger. They'll say, why? And there will be an 1 hour discussion on it. After which, I'll go back to my office and at least 3 ministers will follow me in that office and say, कागज दीजिए. क्यों? मैं इस्तीफा लिख रहा हूँ. They were prepared to go to the extent of resigning from the government on the issue of the transfer of a bureaucrat. But these policy issues, no interest. So, policy making, finance ministry, ideal place for learning the art and science of policy making. I can't think of any better ministry than that. In fact, when I shifted to the Ministry of External Affairs, I realized why so many of my colleagues had so much time.
Yes, please. It's okay. Yes, please.
Dilip Damkar, you mentioned the 3 game changers, and obviously I go along with it. But don't you also think that the Indo-US nuclear deal was also a game changer after the regime of sanctions? From there to India's acceptance as a legitimate nuclear power, wasn't that also a game changer?
You might be aware, Dilip, that I was a person who was completely and thoroughly opposed to the deal. I still am. I am still firmly against the Indo-US nuclear deal. I have my reasons, but the most important reason is we are not dependent either for technology or for nuclear fuel on any country if we just follow the Bhabha doctrine of the 3-stage development of nuclear energy in India. We don't have to depend on anyone. We are beholden to none. The heavy water reactors are our own. Now we are going to have the light water reactors from untested from the US. One doesn't know what is going to happen. 2005, July, was when the agreement or the intent was signed between the 2 countries. We are in 2015. 10 years down the line, nothing has happened on the ground. Nothing at all. So that is why I have not included it as a game changer, because I don't know how much more time it's going to take. And the Prime Minister goes in 2015 to France and signs the deal with Areva. And we know what is happening in Jaitapur. So when will it come? When it will become a game changer? I don't know. And that is why I have not included it as a game changer.
I am Anil Supnekar. How much is vote bank important for either making a policy or changing the policy?
What is?
Vote bank.
Most important considerations. when I told you it is politics all the way, then this is exactly what we are looking at, vote bank. And having said that on a lighter vein, I must also tell you that it is the responsibility of the government of the day to ignore the vote bank and do what they think is correct by the country. You know, I have suffered personally for some of the steps that I took. A lot of people like Vijay Kelkar are giving me credit for reducing interest rates in the country when I was finance minister. But I paid the price for that in my own election in 2004, because we have a lot of employees of the coal sector and other industries in the constituency who were very unhappy with me because their rate of interest from their provident fund got reduced as a result of the bringing down of the administered interest rates. And I have said this at many places that I'll never forget my encounter with an old lady in a remote village in my constituency. When I approached her and said, please vote for me, she said, aren't you the same fellow who raised the price of kerosene from 2 rupee 50 paise to 9 rupee 50 paise? Yes, I had to plead guilty. But am I deterred? No, I am not. And I told a similar gathering in the US, in a university, that given the chance, I will follow the same path, irrespective of vote bank politics. Some of us have to take the courage and give a lie to this vote bank politics in this country.
So you gave a lot of interesting examples on policy making, on the finance and economic side. But I was wondering if you could share a couple of interesting examples on the foreign policy side as well.
Well, one I have already mentioned, that's a nuclear doctrine. The other is, well, one can say that a major policy shift in foreign policy did take place when Mr. Vajpayee was Prime Minister towards the US. We did not come to concluding the nuclear deal with them, but there was a decided shift in accepting the US as a strategic partner for India. The policy towards neighbors, more particularly towards Pakistan, which underwent, some people describe it as flip-flop, but I would see it as the evolution of a distinct policy under Mr. Vajpayee, which combined the carrot and the stick. I have also written about it. It has been published in newspapers. The January 6, 2004 joint press statement between India and Pakistan, which was issued when Mr. Vajpayee had gone to Islamabad for the SAARC summit. After his meeting with General Musharraf, a mere 17-line joint press statement. It was not even a communique, it was not a joint statement, it was just a joint press statement where for the first time it was mentioned that Pakistan will not allow its territory or territory under its control to be used for terrorism and violence against India. That was the bottom line. Then we went out of office in May 2004 and the policy underwent changes. Even today, I would say, we haven't come very far from 2004. And I was therefore very happy when the BJP National Executive clearly in its foreign policy resolution said that terrorism and talks cannot go on together. I don't know how and what many of you feel, but having dealt with Pakistan as the External Affairs Minister of this country, having dealt with Pakistan as a member of parliament and as a private citizen, I have gone to Pakistan a number of times and talked to them. I don't see peace with Pakistan happening in the near future in a hurry. No. And the basic reason for that is that if Dilip Padgaonkar were to go to Pakistan and he talked for, let's say, 20 minutes, somebody from Pakistan in that meeting will say, I must also talk for 20 minutes. It is carrying parity to a ridiculous level, which is what the Pakistanis do all the time. And that is why it's very difficult to reach any agreement with them.
Minister. I am Arun Vakru. Just wanted to ask you that while there are many beautiful examples of participatory governance, like for example the communitization in Nagaland, done by Raghav Sharan Pandey and many other participatory budgeting examples, what could be a way to replicate these beautiful examples all over India? Because there are beautiful examples. I mean, communitization is one, then participatory budgeting. How can we expand these examples all over?
No. There are many such examples in Kerala. What is that famous scheme that they have? Of participation of the people in the developmental and decision-making process. And I am a great votary of it. I was just telling Vijay Kelkar when we had met earlier that Jharkhand is a backward state. My constituency is particularly backward in Jharkhand. I was telling him about 4 weeks ago I went to a village and I found that the agricultural fields around the village were as lush with the winter crop, especially wheat, as the fields in Punjab and Haryana and Western UP are. Why? Because the villagers have got together and set an example. Government had no role to play in this. They got together, they formed this Pani Panchayat, they're regulating it, they're running it, and the whole thing is working beautifully. So wherever we have examples of people's initiatives, they are one of the finest examples in our democracy of what people themselves can achieve, irrespective of what policies are followed by the state government or the central government.
नमस्कार सर, शंकर जी। एक सवाल मेरे पास रह गया है। You spoke about many game-changing moments, but there is one game changer, namely Mr. Chandrasekhar, who was the Prime Minister who was instrumental in two major game-changing moments of India. One, the shift in foreign policy, and second, the shift in economic policy. Now there is talk about a memorial for Mr. Rao being built. लेकिन शिलान्यास जिसने किया उसके लिए भी तो एक मंदिर बनना चाहिए ना?
I have, Mr. Shankar Iyer, the highest regard and admiration for Mr. Chandrasekhar. Not only because I worked with him, but I knew what kind of a person he was and what vision he had for India. But I agree with you. He did initiate some game-changing ideas. It's only that he couldn't continue long enough to get them adopted as policies of the government of India. So many of these things happened much later. For instance, the economic reforms that were initiated in his time, and given his socialist background, I must say that it was much more of a departure from his traditional thinking than it would have been for other people. Or the permission given to the US Air Force planes to land in India for refueling in 1991 when the Gulf War was going on, was again something which fructified much later. At that point of time, it was only criticism that he faced. And of course, I'll rate him, though he was very briefly the Prime Minister of this country, as one of the greatest Prime Ministers that I have seen. And I'll say this about him and about Mr. Vajpayee, that the great thing about both these leaders was they were absolutely pragmatic. Never allowed prejudices of any kind to creep into policy making, and held their sway. And I'd like to mention to you one example of the kind of opposition that I faced as finance minister from a sister organization of the Sangh Parivar, namely the Swadeshi Jagran Manch. How did I survive? I survived because of the support that Mr. Vajpayee gave me. So the understanding and the pragmatism of the Prime Minister in our system of government becomes most important consideration for policy to evolve and to be executed.
I'd like this lady, please. Yes. Your name, please.
I'm Sanjali Dias. I would like to ask you and Kelkar sir also this question. This is about GST.
Yeah, speak into the mic.
I'm speaking actually.
No, just
This is about Goods and Service Tax Act. Sir, recently the bill which tabled, the 1% tax is introduced on the exporting state, the turnover of the exporting state. And the basic objective of the GST is it is a destination consumption based tax. So introducing two components like SGST and CGST, don't you think we are distancing away from the objective of GST? Having 29 states and 7 union territories with all tax.
No, I entirely agree with you that it's not consistent with the consumption-based tax concept. But as I understand, it's a transitory measure and it's going to go away within 2 years. It's not a permanent measure that in future it's continued to have. It's a transitionary measure, temporary, and will vanish over a specified amount of time.
I'd like to add that the exercise is going on, and one other thought connected with this, which maybe I should have mentioned in the beginning, is the role that parliamentary standing committees have come to play in policy making in Government of India. Now, a serious standing committee does its work very seriously, and Vijay Kelkar will agree that we took up the goods and services tax in the standing committee when I was chairing it, and we had a number of discussions. And in fact, when I found that the members were veering to a non-GST view, I invited Vijay Kelkar to come again before the committee so that he could persuade them in favor of the GST. But I agree with Vijay that these are all temporary measures, and once the GST is promulgated, it will subsume all these taxes. And so it does not in any way militate against the introduction of the GST. GST is something which has been accepted, it is now being expected, and the government is keen to make it possible as soon as possible.
Yes, please. No, sorry, I meant the gentleman at the back.
Ajit Vaidya. Two questions. One is about the mostly finance policies have been driven by the idea of capitalism. After 25 years of liberalization and globalization since 91, the disparity of incomes and the kind of social condition of BPL, the below poverty level people, has not significantly improved. How can we fix this? What kind of policy we need for that? Second, we have many commissions, like Dr. Kelkar heads many commissions, but the political leadership never listens to the recommendations of those commissions. As you said, the policy making is mostly ad hoc in India. How can we fix this? Thank you.
Well, you have mentioned disparity in incomes. This is one issue. I talked about the backward regions, for instance, of this country. There are villages in this country, and that's why I told Vijay when we were framing policies together that India lives in every century of time, which are completely deprived and not the slightest ray of development has touched the life of those villages. This is a collective national failure, and we have to do something about it. I don't know when and how it will be done, but I own my part of responsibility for it. Commissions are appointed, commissions are, they submit their reports. Sometimes the reports are acted upon. When Mr. Vijay Kelkar and I were working together in the Ministry of Finance, I remember he suggested and I accepted the fact that we should have a competition policy in this country. And we set up a committee under Raghavan to study the whole thing and give us a report. And it saw the light of the day in terms of not a competition policy yet, but a competition commission. Then I remember it was his advice that we should do something to improve collection of national statistics. And we again set up a committee under Dr. Rangarajan to advise the government on this, and the report was received and we acted upon it. And the National Statistical Commission was set up as a result of that. So I will say sometimes the reports are acted upon, sometimes they are not acted upon. And one of the major reports which has not been acted upon fully is the Sarkaria Commission report, which has remained, parts of it have remained pending over the last decades.
Please go.
So, you said the abolition of a planning commission is a major game changer. In what way will it have positive influence? What will be its replacement?
Dr. Swarup, it will depend on which is the path we take from here, because it is still work in progress. And I said when I was talking earlier that we have abolished the planning commission, but we have not abolished the plan. Now, what should really happen? To my mind, the Government of India accounting procedures need to undergo cataclysmic changes. This division between plan and non-plan should go now that there is no planning commission, and after the 12th plan perhaps there will be no plan at the national level. And also the capital and revenue in which our expenditure is classified are completely outdated and do not capture the spirit of the expenditure incurred. So hopefully with the abolition of the planning commission, we'll have no plans after the 12th five-year plan. We'll chart out a course which will then take care of the accounting procedures of the Government of India. And that in itself will be a major revolutionary, new revolutionary step about expenditure reform, which has been a crying need in our country, because we just carried on from 1950 onwards. With part of it is British, part of it is from 1950 plan, non-plan and all that. So it is the beginning of a change, of a major change, but how will it unfold is still in the future.
The lady, please.
Good evening, sir, and the respected people on the dais. I am Dipanjali Shukla from the MIT School of Government. So I'm very happy to know that the government is aware of the failure in the implementation of the policies. But my question is that whether the government is aware of the lack of evaluation in the already existing policies. We have the population and the health policies dating back to 2000 and 2002. We feel that the policy should change according to the changing time. And what's your take on that? Thank you.
My take is that I agree with you entirely. That policies have to undergo changes with time. These are not Vedas which were written and they have to be followed. So a policy has to be practical, it has to be implementable, And if we notice after evaluation that there are defects which have crept up, then we should change the policy in those parts. Even change the entire policy, throw it out of the window, admit failure. But don't just carry on with the dead weight of a failed policy.
Myself, Sudhanva Kopadekar. I would like to seek your views about funding the massive infrastructure needs. Second, whether really we will, as a country, will try and succeed in gold unlocking, which is locked up in so many of devasthans and so many idle resources. And the third one, reduction in dependence on foreign oil and gas.
Reduction on the dependence of foreign oil.
You should be in the Parliament of India. That is my first reaction, because in Parliament we are experts in weaving 3-4 questions in one question. The presiding officer will say only one question. So we'll say part A, part B, part C. And if the speaker says, please stop now, we'll say, I am stopping. In the end, I like to say, ultimately, I 3 questions in one. Infra funding is a major issue. Every government has tried to find ways and means of funding infrastructure, including external funding, if we can find the sources. But it's a huge, humongous demand. I don't know, $2 trillion, $3 trillion is what they say is needed to fix the infrastructure in this country. All of it will not come suddenly, but we'll have to find ways and means of finding it. When we went for insurance reforms and we went for pension reforms, the idea was that we should be able to unlock long-term funds which will become available for infrastructure funding through the insurance sector and through the pension sector. And hopefully that is happening with a lag of time. Then we have, as I said, external funding agencies. They have to be approached. On the question of the gold reserves of Devasthan, Sthanams, as you said, I have been personally very opposed to the idea of amnesty schemes every now and then, because I feel that that is a major disincentive to the honest taxpayers. We'll not pay taxes. We'll just wait for some amnesty scheme or the other. But the temples are in a different category, and there are ancient reserves of gold. Maybe for the temples we can have a scheme of monetizing the gold in some way or the other. I think in this budget the finance minister has talked of a gold scheme. At the individual level it does not pay, it only helps people escape the tax net. But for the temples, yes. And your third question was, how long are we going to depend on foreign countries for petroleum and gas? What could be the answer for that? I mean, he's an expert on the petroleum sector. But until we become self-sufficient, we'll have to continue to depend on foreign supplies. And in an interconnected world, I would not necessarily look at it as sin, that we are depending on gas from somewhere else, we are depending on the crude petroleum oil from somewhere else. It's part of the accepted global system now. And we should go along. At the same time, we should concentrate on developing our own reserves wherever we can find them.
One last question. Yes. Last question.
Thank you. I'm Amitabh Malik from PIC. First of all, let me thank you, sir, for sharing so many of the personal perspectives, illuminating us with so much of wisdom. Your comment that politics is the bottom line was very telling, but one wonders whether, like in other countries, when it comes to national security, everything else takes second priority. Can you share with us an occasion or an instance or your experience where this kind of a unity could be perceived in our country? And if I may add just one small question, in terms of a policy, there is a bit of a confusion right now that on the other hand, the new government came in with a development agenda, and yet we are getting cross signals, whether it's some kind of a Hindutva agenda. Thank you, sir.
As far as issues of national security are concerned, I would say that we have a much larger degree of consensus than we have on economic issues, especially when there has been, what shall I say, a national crisis or a major national security issue and the country has come under threat. Then politics has not prevailed. Then everybody comes around and is prepared to support the government of the day. And I can cite to you some examples of this, that for instance, there was mild criticism of the nuclear tests in 1998. But then it just withered away. It didn't last very long. There was some criticism of the nuclear doctrine, but again, it's been accepted by and large. When the Indian Airlines plane was hijacked from Kathmandu, for instance, in 1999, there was a very large degree of consensus about what we should do, including the fact that we should get the people back home somehow or the other. Subsequently, after the event, many people became wiser and started criticizing. And I think if Jaswant Singh ji had not gone with that plane to Kandahar, the criticism would have been perhaps muted. Kargil is another example where I remember we were in consultation with all the political parties on a very regular basis, and we had the widest possible consensus on how to deal with the intruders in Kargil. So on national security, I would say we have a much better record than we have on economic policy. To the second part of your question about the Hindutva elements, I would say these are aberrations. The basic agenda continues to be development. But, given the kind of role that the visual media is playing now, and you just have to watch the debates every evening on some of the channels to realize complete non-issues which they take up. Complete non-issues. Like the parliament, I once said, Anuji, that if there was an instrument like a Geiger counter to measure the extent of boredom in a given room, Parliament of India will take the cake. Until I went to the United Nations General Assembly.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Chandra. He is someone who moved from being an IAS officer to a politician, but today's talk is neither as an IAS officer or a politician, but a wise, experienced citizen, very much concerned about the well-being of India. I think that comes out so clearly. Just a few things for us to remember. He asked a very bold and courageous thing. He made a statement, politics takes over everything. Politician will not mind running the country to the ground for his selfish purpose. And we all experience this almost on a daily basis. Policy making has been ad hoc and is not a result of wide consultation and thought through. And he, with a sense of humor, gave a wonderful example of his car being stuck and what happened. That was a wonderful thing. There is a misuse of government funds from being used for what it is meant to be used. I think these are very, very important things. If you are not in touch with ground reality, the policy will never work and the people will take law into their own hands. Best of policy without thinking through about implementation will fail. This needs partnership between center, state and panchayat. And there is no penalty for faulty policy. I wish we had more politicians like Mr. Sinha. Unfortunately, you've stepped down as a politician. I wish you were there. Our country badly needs it. So I thank you very much for your wonderful.
Friends, as I mentioned, that this is inauguration of a series of lectures. I just want to give a sort of curtain raiser about next three lectures are going to come at PIC. This would be by Shivram Krishnan, who is the chairman of Center for Policy Research, who, as you know, one of the foremost in Indian expert in urban policy. He was the one who was participated and designed and guided 74th Amendment. Then it will be Professor Shankaracharya, who has designed maximum number of budgets in India. And as the minister said, the Ministry of Finance is the best place to understand policy making, art and science. Here's the maximum number of them. So Shankaracharya will speak. And then would be by Dr. Narendra Jadhav. He will speak on making a policy with Member Planning Commission and designing policy in the social sector, particularly education. So these are the next three lectures, and then we may have a few more ideas that eventually, sir, to bring out there are two people who will edit this book in book form. Is Professor Vaishika, which I mentioned, one of our leading political scientists, and Nirendra Jadhav, who is also a member of the committee and is the managing editor of Mint, and also Professor Apte. So three of them will work on and will bring out eventually as a book form the outcome of this lecture.
Thank you. I guess just a couple more minutes. First of all, I'll just add to the chairperson's vote of thanks and say that Mr. Sinha sir, thank you so very much for coming all the way to Pune, spending this time with us. The last 2 hours that we spent here, a lot of deep insights, but very interestingly with a great sense of humor, which made it very, very interesting for all of us. We are going to keep the recordings, of course, with a bit of editing that we need to do for the sanity, and that will be available for many, many of us to learn from. As a small token of appreciation, may I request the chairperson to kindly present a copy of a book to Mr. Sinha. Thank you, sir. And thank you, ma'am, for agreeing to chair the session. We know out of all these hectic schedules, we always have to look at the parliament on when it's running and when it's not, so that we could have time of our trustee to kind of make this happen. It's a bit odd to say thanks to Dr. Kelkar, but I must mention that we have a tiny office for PIC while we are waiting for a big one to come. It's a 2 BHK we have. And you know what, at least once or twice a week, we have the honor of having Dr. Kelkar to sit with us for a few hours and to work out quite a few of these details. I must say, sir, thank you for that. I think it's thanks to that we have been able to put all of this together. Of course, in the same breath, I must also say that's true about quite a few of our trustees as well as our members who make it to the PIC office, and I think it's that energy of these trustees and members that makes PIC what it is. We don't yet have a building, we don't yet have an office, and we are around for what, last 40 months? We have done what, 50 plus programs? We have 300 plus members, 26 academic institutions. The good part is it's like in a cloud, as they call in the IT world these days. We go to any of the institutes, sir, and it becomes kind of our place, because let's Yashoda is our institutional member, and we make it our home in a sense. So I must thank Yashoda, the team of Yashoda, who kind of made it all possible. Huge thanks to our institutional member, the deans of those institutes who have come here and who also wanted their students to benefit from this. Our friends in media for sure. And I must mention the PIC team that's ably led by Kiran Pardeshi as manager, as well as Amresh and a set of team that we have, who made all the nuts and bolts happen so that we could have the benefit of such a session, and they continue to do that. So huge thanks to that, and please join me to have a clap of hands and join hands to them. Thank you. Last but not the least, and I mentioned it yesterday's program as well. All of you and most of you sitting in the back rows, guys and girls, it's for you. It's for the students. That all of the trustees remind me again and again that we need to organize more and more programs for you so that you all benefit. And I'm so glad that you made it. You took time out to come here. And for your benefit, most of this would also be uploaded on the portals, the website, and the social media, that's the Facebook as well as the Twitter. So please go on there and join it, and we'll see you more often. With that, and a huge thanks to the guest today, Mr. Sinha, I announce that we conclude the program today. Thank you.